We're finally ready to start modeling short-run business cycle fluctuations. Now, some people get confused because there are three lines here, right? And they all cross in kind of funny ways, so sometimes it's hard to figure out what's going on. I've tried to type out the steps for solving these problems so you can more easily know how to work through them. All right, so first, we're going to take the event given and we're going to decide whether that event shifts aggregate demand or short-run aggregate supply or long-run aggregate supply, although that would not be a business cycle fluctuation. And then we're going to think about which direction it shifts. Then we're going to use the diagram to show the impact in the short run. Okay, and the short run impact is going to be found where short run aggregate supply is equal to aggregate demand. And then we're going to figure out how the economy will return to a long run equilibrium. Remember, the long run equilibrium is where all three lines intersect. And it's primarily determined by the intersection of aggregate demand and long run aggregate supply. All right, so let's work through an example here. In this video, we're going to be talking about aggregate demand shocks, and I've got two examples for you. So the first example is that we have a recession in Europe, and that is going to decrease demand for goods produced in the United States. So I've already told you the answer to the first step, right? I've already told you which line is going to be shifted by this event, okay? But if you didn't know that, what you would want to think is, right, does this affect the inputs or technology that the US has to produce products? No. Does it affect demand or consumption of products produced in the US? Yes, right? So remember, aggregate demand is made up of consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. And this is going to affect the net exports piece of aggregate demand. So what's happening here is that since Europe is in recession, there's a decrease in demand for goods produced in the US, which will lead to a decrease in exports, meaning a decrease in aggregate demand. So we figured out the first step here. We figured out which line has shifted and which direction it moves. So let's go ahead and draw that on the graph. All right, so we've got our new aggregate demand curve here. You know what? I'm going to actually just draw that in a different color so that we don't get too confused with all the lines going on now. Okay, so we got our new aggregate demand curve. And the next step is to figure out what's happening in this economy in the short run. So in the short run, we're going to look at where our new aggregate demand curve intersects our short run aggregate supply curve. And that will tell me what's happening to output in the short run. You can see that output has decreased relative to the long run potential output. What's happening here? The US still has the same productive capacity. We have the same number of workers, the same number of, the same natural resources, the same capital, the same technology. We can produce just as much as we could before. However, because of this inward shift in aggregate demand, okay, we have a decrease in the overall price level. Right? So we started out at A, that's our original equilibrium. And if the economy was functioning perfectly and everyone magically overnight adjusted to the new price level, we would simply see a decrease in prices with no change in output. Right? We can produce the same amount of stuff. So we're going to keep doing that because demand for that has decreased. The price level of the US would decrease, but we would still have the same output. Now, that's what would happen if the economy was functioning perfectly and we didn't have that upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. But because we have these market imperfections, right? We have sticky wages, sticky prices, or misperceptions, or some combination of those. It's difficult for us to adjust to a new price level in the short run. And so here in the short run, because of one of those market imperfections, people misinterpret prices, they misinterpret, they can't adjust their wages or prices downwards. We're gonna have a contraction or a shrinking of output, even though our overall productive capacity has remained the same. So here in the short run, the economy would move from A to B, right, due to one of those reasons why short run aggregate supply is upward sloping, okay? Price level was lower than expected. Here have resulted in a recession or a contraction in the economy. All right, so in the short run here, we're gonna have a recession. How does the economy return to a new long run equilibrium? Well, a long run aggregate supply curve is not gonna move, right? That's the same, nothing has changed to change our real productive capacity. What's gonna happen here is that our expectations about prices change, right? Over time, we can adjust wages or we can adjust prices downward, and we begin to expect or understand this new lower price level. And that means that our short run aggregate supply curve is going to shift out in order to bring us back to a long run equilibrium at the same level of output as before, simply with a lower price level. So in the long run, as we adjust to the new lower price level, short run aggregate supply will shift out, right? People will be willing to supply a larger quantity of goods at a lower price because they know that prices overall are lower. And we will return, right? We're moving in the short run from A to B, and in the long run from B to C. All right. Now, I know that this can be a little bit confusing. So again, if you have questions, go to the discussion boards and come to my office hours, make an appointment with me. I'm happy to walk you through this again. We're gonna do one more example now, not of a recession, but an expansion based on a shift in aggregate demand. All right, so the next example is, suppose that businesses are feeling optimistic about the economy and they increase investment spending, okay? Which part of aggregate demand is this? Of course, it's investment, I. We have an increase in investment spending due to confidence in the economy. That's going to lead to an increase in aggregate demand. So the first step here is to shift out aggregate demand. And now we want to say what's going to happen as a result of this aggregate demand shock in the short run, and then how do we return to a long run equilibrium? So in the short run, right, this is our initial equilibrium point, A. In the short run, we're going to see an increase in output. I should do this. Just label here what's happening, short run, long run changes. Okay, I'm gonna have an increase in output in the short run. Businesses, all of a sudden, they're excited. They're trying to grow, right, and invest in expanding. That's not necessarily a bad thing if it's based on our fundamentals in our production function. But in this case, it's not. It's just simply based on a feeling that they have. And so as businesses start to try to expand, okay, what's going to happen is they're going to realize that there aren't more inputs, right? There's not more labor, there's not more capital, and now all the businesses across all sectors in our economy are trying to expand, right? That's going to drive up input prices, right? So this is going to drive up prices for inputs and really all goods across the economy. Now that increased price level shouldn't really affect overall production, but in this case, right, it might. So as we see this increase in aggregate demand, okay, this is going to lead to here this short run expansion. So in the short run, we move from point A to point B, where we have a new higher price level and higher level of output. So we have an expansion of the economy. And of course, we know the relation on this graph, we have what's happening to GDP, right? That's output. What's happening to inflation? That's the price level, right? We also have, right, some sense of what should be happening to unemployment, because we know that unemployment and GDP have this inverse relationship, a strong inverse relationship. So here, as output is increasing, unemployment should be decreasing. Well, this growth level here is more than what we can sustain in the long run, right? We just simply don't have more workers or more natural resources or better technology. None of that has changed. And so we cannot remain at this higher level of output in the long run. As businesses begin to realize that they're not going to be able to get the workers, or the price of labor is going up, then short run aggregate supply is going to shift inward, right, as we adjust to that new higher price level. Okay, got an increase in input costs, and then all prices will adjust upward. As we show that on the graph, short run aggregate supply is decreasing, right? We require a higher price to produce the same quantity of products. And then that's going to move us back here to this long run equilibrium point C, where again, all three lines are intersecting, and that means that our price level is increasing again, but our output returns to this same long run potential level. All right. Good. So this is, again, this is an example of a recession driven by aggregate demand shock. This is an example of an expansion driven by an aggregate demand shock. And we typically think that most business cycles are driven by shifts in aggregate demand, although there can be other things that are going on as well. We've talked already about the impact of the coronavirus on our real productive capacity, okay? And in the next video, we'll talk about an example of a short run aggregate supply shock. But typically we think of most business cycle fluctuations are driven by shocks to aggregate demand. And that will help us to inform the types of policy that we would adopt to try to minimize those fluctuations. I also just want to point out here that in this example, we have inflation, right? We have price inflation here due to expansion, right? So we talked a little bit about the relationship between GDP and price level or inflation. And I told you before that prices tend to increase during economic expansions, okay? And this is an explanation as to why. This is called demand pull inflation. All right, but we do have a different type of inflation that can occur in times of recession, and we'll see that in the next example, okay, when we talk about shocks to short-run aggregate supply. The last thing I want to say here is that our current situation with coronavirus is complicated because, like we talked about last time, we've had a shock to our real productive capacity because people are at home, they're not working. We've had people die, right? This is decreasing our productive capacity. And that's a shift in long run aggregate supply. However, we also have a shock to aggregate demand because consumer incomes are decreasing as people are out of work, right? People are worried about the economy. There's a lot of uncertainty right now. People are spending less money because they're stuck at home, right? So we have both a shock to long run aggregate supply and a shock to aggregate demand, all right? So we've got kind of this two-prong recession force attacking us right now. But the good news is that as we address the public health concerns and people are able to go back to work eventually, then our long run aggregate supply curve should bounce back pretty quickly. The thing that we'll be most worried about in the recovery period is the recovery to aggregate demand. Will people all of a sudden go back to spending the way that they used to spend? Or will we have some drop in consumer spending? Business probably have a drop in new businesses opening, right? I don't know. These are the risks that we face in terms of a prolonged recession or slow recovery. And so most economists are stressing not only relief for people now as their incomes have fallen short during the crisis, but also additional stimulus after we start opening the economy back up to get things going again. And we're going to talk more about monetary and fiscal policy, what we can do in terms of stimulating the economy in a few videos. But I think it's important to mention here what we're going through because it really helps us understand the economic piece of this puzzle to put it in the context of our aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. All right, good. So next video, short run aggregate supply shocks. I'll see you there.